The morning mist hung heavy over the ancient stone walls of Ravenscroft Palace as Camilla pressed her trembling hands against the cold window glass. She had been awake since dawn, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Today was the day she would finally escape the golden cage that had held her prisoner for 3 long years. Camilla had arrived at the palace as a young woman of 22, brought here after her father's debts had forced him to make an arrangement with the cruel Duke of Ravenscroft. What was supposed to be a temporary arrangement to work off her family's obligations had turned into something far more sinister. The Duke had developed an unhealthy obsession with keeping her at the palace, claiming she owed more money than could ever be repaid. The palace guards watched her every move, reporting back to the Duke about where she went and who she spoke with. Camilla had learned to keep her head down and speak only when spoken to, but inside her heart burned with the desire for freedom. She missed her younger sister Emma terribly, and wondered if her family even knew she was still alive. Over the months, Camilla had carefully observed the guards' routines and patrol schedules. She noticed that during the early morning hours there was a brief window when the east gate was less heavily monitored. The guard named Marcus, who usually stood watch there, would sometimes step away for a few minutes to check on the stable horses. This was her chance. For weeks, Camilla had been secretly gathering small items she could carry with her. She had saved a few coins from the meager allowance the Duke provided, wrapped some bread and dried fruit in a cloth bundle, and packed her mother's silver locket, the only thing of value she still possessed. She also carried a letter she had written to her family, explaining what had happened to her and begging their forgiveness for disappearing so suddenly. The palace kitchen staff had grown fond of Camilla over the years. Mrs. Henderson, the head cook, had noticed the sadness in the young woman's eyes and often slipped her extra food. Sarah, one of the younger kitchen maids, had become something of a friend, though Camilla was careful never to reveal her escape plans. She couldn't risk putting anyone else in danger. As the sun began to rise higher, Camilla made her way down the servants' corridors toward the east wing of the palace. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. She carried a cleaning bucket and rags as a disguise, pretending to be going about her normal morning duties. The stone floors were cold beneath her worn shoes, and she pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. The Duke's voice echoed from somewhere in the distance, and Camilla froze. He was speaking with someone about expanding the guard presence around the palace grounds. Her blood ran cold as she realized her window of opportunity might be closing forever. She had to act now, or she might never get another chance. Camilla quickened her pace, staying close to the walls and avoiding the main hallways, where she might encounter other servants or guards. She knew that if she was caught trying to leave, the Duke would punish her severely. He had made it clear on several occasions that she belonged to him now, and that no one left his service without his permission. The east corridor seemed longer than usual as Camilla made her way toward the gate. Every shadow looked like a guard. Every sound made her jump. She passed the library where she had spent many lonely hours reading books about far-off places she dreamed of visiting. She walked by the conservatory where she had tended to the Duke's exotic plants, always under the watchful eye of a guard. Finally, Camilla reached the heavy wooden door that led to the east courtyard. Through the small window she could see Marcus standing at his post near the gate. He appeared to be alone, but she knew she had to wait for the right moment when he would step away. Her hands shook as she clutched her small bundle of belongings closer to her chest. Minutes felt like hours as Camilla waited in the shadows. The morning air was crisp, and she could hear birds singing in the trees beyond the palace walls. Those sounds represented freedom to her, a world where she could make her own choices and live her own life. She thought about her sister Emma, who would be 19 now, and wondered if she had married or had children of her own. The Duke had occasionally brought news of the outside world, but always in a way that made it sound dangerous and frightening. He told her that her family had moved away and forgotten about her, that the world beyond the palace walls was full of criminals and desperate people who would take advantage of a young woman traveling alone. Camilla had never believed these stories completely, but they had planted seeds of doubt in her mind. As she watched Marcus through the window, Camilla noticed something unusual in the distance. There appeared to be some kind of commotion near the main gate on the opposite side of the palace. She could hear raised voices and the sound of horses approaching. This might be the distraction she needed to make her escape even easier. Marcus seemed to notice the disturbance as well. He looked toward the main gate with concern, clearly torn between his duty to guard the east entrance and his curiosity about what was happening elsewhere. Camilla held her breath, knowing that this moment could change the course of her entire life. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor behind her made Camilla's heart skip a beat. Someone was coming and she had nowhere to hide. She pressed herself against the wall, hoping that whoever it was would pass by without noticing her. The footsteps grew closer, and she could hear the distinctive sound of heavy boots that could only belong to a palace guard. Camilla closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer, clutching her mother's locket through the fabric of her bundle. Everything she had planned and hoped for hung in the balance of the next few moments. Would she finally taste freedom, or would her dreams be crushed once again by the iron grip of the Duke's control? The footsteps stopped just a few feet away from where Camilla stood frozen against the cold stone wall. She could hear heavy breathing and the creak of leather armor. Her entire body tensed as she prepared for the worst, but then the footsteps continued past her hiding spot and faded into the distance. Relief flooded through her so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. When Camilla looked back toward the east gate, she saw her opportunity. Marcus had indeed stepped away from his post, drawn by the commotion at the main entrance. The gate stood unguarded for what might be only a few precious minutes. This was her moment, and she knew she might never get another chance like this. Moving as quietly as she could, Camilla slipped through the door and into the east courtyard. The morning air hit her face like a promise of freedom, cool and fresh with the scent of wildflowers growing beyond the palace walls. She stayed close to the building's shadow as she made her way toward the gate, her heart hammering against her ribs. The iron gate was tall and imposing, but Camilla had studied it carefully during her weeks of planning. There was a smaller side entrance used by servants and delivery people, secured with a heavy lock that she had seen Marcus open countless times. She had memorized the way he turned the key, always clockwise 3 times before pulling the latch. As Camilla reached for the gate, she noticed that Marcus had left his keyring hanging on a hook beside his post. Her hands trembled as she lifted the keys, searching for the right one. The metal felt cold and heavy in her fingers, and she struggled to keep them steady enough to work the lock. Time seemed to slow down as she fumbled with the mechanism, every second stretching like an eternity. Behind her, the sounds from the main gate grew louder. She could hear the Duke's voice rising above the others, angry and commanding. Whatever was happening there had clearly upset him greatly, and Camilla knew that his bad moods often led to increased security measures throughout the palace. She had to get through this gate before the disturbance ended and normal routines resumed. The key finally turned with a satisfying click, and the gate swung open just enough for Camilla to slip through. She replaced the keys on their hook and stepped outside the palace walls for the first time in 3 years. The sensation was overwhelming. She was actually free, standing on ground that didn't belong to the Duke, breathing air that wasn't trapped within stone walls. The path beyond the gate led through a small wooded area before connecting to the main road that wound toward the nearest village. Camilla had studied this route from her window countless times, memorizing every turn and landmark. She knew that the village was about 5 miles away, and from there she could find transportation to take her back to her family's region. As she walked quickly along the forest path, Camilla allowed herself to feel a spark of hope she hadn't experienced in years. The trees seemed to welcome her with their gentle rustling, and sunlight filtered through the leaves in golden patches that warmed her face. She thought about Emma, imagining the joy on her sister's face when Camilla finally returned home. But her happiness was short-lived. Behind her, she heard the unmistakable sound of the palace alarm bell ringing out across the grounds. Someone had discovered her absence, and it wouldn't be long before guards were sent to search for her. Camilla broke into a run, her skirts tangling around her legs as she pushed through the underbrush. The forest path was rougher than it had appeared from her window. Branches caught at her shawl and roots threatened to trip her with every step. Camilla's bundle bounced against her side as she ran, and she worried that she might lose the precious few belongings she had managed to gather. The bread and dried fruit would be essential for her journey, and her mother's locket was the only connection she had left to her family. As the alarm bell continued to echo through the woods, Camilla heard something that made her blood freeze, the sound of horses approaching from behind. The Duke's guards were already in pursuit, and they were moving much faster than she could on foot. She veered off the main path, hoping to lose them in the thicker parts of the forest where horses couldn't easily follow. The underbrush was dense and thorny, tearing at her dress and scratching her arms as she pushed through it. Camilla could hear the guards calling out to each other, their voices getting closer with each passing moment. They seemed to know exactly which direction she had gone, as if they had experience tracking escaped servants through these very woods. A terrible thought occurred to Camilla as she struggled through the brambles. What if she wasn't the first person to attempt an escape from Ravenscroft Palace? What if other young women had tried to flee before her, only to be dragged back to face the Duke's wrath? The idea that she might be following in the footsteps of failed escapees filled her with a new kind of terror. She stumbled into a small clearing where a stream bubbled over smooth rocks. The water looked clean and inviting, and Camilla realized how thirsty she had become. But she didn't dare stop to drink. The sound of the horses was getting louder, and she could now make out individual voices among the guards. One of them was shouting orders in a deep, authoritative tone that she didn't recognize. Camilla splashed across the stream, hoping that the water might help hide her trail from any tracking dogs the guards might have brought with them. The cold water soaked through her worn shoes and chilled her feet, but she pressed on toward the far side of the clearing. Just as she reached the edge of the trees, she heard the thundering of hooves entering the clearing behind her. A commanding voice rang out across the water. "There!"
"I can see her on the other side."
Camilla's heart sank as she realized she had been spotted. All her careful planning and desperate hopes were crumbling around her like the walls of a sandcastle. But she refused to give up without a fight. She plunged back into the forest, running harder than she ever had in her life. Branches whipped across her face and her lungs burned with the effort. But Camilla pushed forward with the determination of someone who had nothing left to lose. Behind her, she could hear the guards dismounting and giving chase on foot through the thick undergrowth. The irony wasn't lost on her that after 3 years of being trapped within the palace walls, she might be captured just minutes after finally tasting freedom. But even if they caught her, even if the Duke punished her severely for this attempt, Camilla knew she would never stop trying to escape. The brief taste of freedom had awakened something inside her that could never be imprisoned again. The chase through the forest continued for what felt like hours, though it had probably been only minutes. Camilla's dress was torn in several places, and her carefully braided hair had come loose, streaming behind her as she ran. Her bundle of belongings felt heavier with each step, but she couldn't bring herself to abandon the few precious items she had managed to gather. Just when she thought her legs might give out completely, Camilla spotted something ahead that made her heart leap with hope. An old stone bridge crossing a wider stream, and beyond it, the beginnings of farmland. If she could reach the farm, she might be able to find someone willing to help her, or at least hide until the immediate pursuit died down. But as she approached the bridge, a figure stepped out from behind one of the stone pillars. It was a palace guard she didn't recognize, a tall man with graying hair and kind eyes that seemed oddly out of place on someone in the Duke's service. He wore the same dark blue uniform as the other guards, but something about his demeanor was different, less threatening, more concerned than angry. "Please, miss," the guard called out, holding up his hands in a gesture that seemed more like a request than a command. "There's no need to run anymore. You're only going to hurt yourself in these woods." Camilla skidded to a halt, trapped between this unknown guard and the sounds of pursuit from behind. Her chest heaved as she struggled to catch her breath, and she clutched her bundle protectively against her body. "I won't go back," she gasped, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "I can't go back there." The guard took a step closer, and Camilla noticed that he moved slowly, deliberately, as if he was trying not to frighten a wounded animal. "My name is Captain Harrison," he said gently. "I've been with the palace guard for 20 years, and I've never seen someone run with such determination. You must have a very good reason for risking so much." Behind Camilla, the other guards were getting closer. She could hear them crashing through the underbrush, calling out to each other as they followed her trail. Soon they would reach this clearing, and her brief moment of freedom would be over. But something about Captain Harrison's tone made her hesitate instead of immediately running past him. "The Duke said you were dangerous," Captain Harrison continued, "that you had stolen valuable items from the palace and were trying to flee with them. But looking at you now, I'm beginning to think there might be more to this story than His Grace shared with us." Camilla's eyes widened in shock and anger. "Stolen? she repeated, her voice rising despite her exhaustion.
These are my own belongings.
This bread I saved for my own meals. These coins from the small allowance he gives me, and this locket belonged to my mother. She pulled the silver chain from her bundle, holding it up so Captain Harrison could see it clearly. The captain's expression grew troubled as he examined the simple silver locket. It was clearly old and well-loved, definitely not the kind of valuable palace treasure the Duke had described. "What about the letter?" he asked quietly. "His Grace mentioned something about important documents." "A letter to my family," Camilla said, her voice breaking slightly. "Telling them I'm alive, asking them to forgive me for disappearing so suddenly. I didn't choose to come here, Captain Harrison. My father owed money, and the Duke said I could work off the debt. That was 3 years ago, and he still claims I owe more than when I started." Captain Harrison's frown deepened as he processed this information. In his 20 years of service, he had seen the Duke make many questionable decisions, but he had always told himself that it wasn't his place to question his employer's actions. However, looking at this frightened young woman with her simple belongings and tear-stained face, he was beginning to wonder if he had been turning a blind eye to something much worse than poor judgment. The sound of approaching guards grew louder, and Camilla looked desperately toward the farmland beyond the bridge. "Please," she whispered, "I just want to go home to my sister. I haven't seen her in 3 years. I don't even know if my parents are still alive." Before Captain Harrison could respond, 3 other guards burst into the clearing. They were breathing heavily from the chase, and their faces showed a mixture of relief and frustration at having finally cornered their quarry. The leader, a burly man named Sergeant Blake, immediately moved to grab Camilla's arm. "Finally caught the little thief," Blake said roughly, reaching for her bundle. "The Duke wants to see what she's stolen before we bring her back." "Wait," Captain Harrison said firmly, stepping between Blake and Camilla. "I want to examine her belongings first. The Duke asked me to lead this search, and I'll decide how to proceed." Blake looked surprised but backed down, recognizing the captain's authority. Harrison gently held out his hand to Camilla, and after a moment's hesitation, she passed him her bundle. She watched nervously as he carefully unwrapped the cloth and examined each item: the small pieces of bread and dried fruit, the few copper coins, the letter to her family, and finally the silver locket. Captain Harrison opened the locket and found a tiny portrait of a woman who bore a strong resemblance to Camilla, along with a lock of brown hair. It was clearly a personal family heirloom, not palace property. He read the first few lines of the letter, which were filled with apologies and expressions of love for family members, with no mention of palace secrets or valuable information. "These aren't stolen goods," Captain Harrison announced, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "These are this young woman's personal possessions." He looked directly at Camilla as he carefully rewrapped her belongings. "However, my duty requires me to escort you back to the palace so that this matter can be properly resolved." Camilla's heart sank, but she noticed something in Captain Harrison's tone that gave her a small spark of hope. Unlike the other guards, he seemed genuinely concerned about doing the right thing, not just following orders blindly. Perhaps back at the palace she might find an ally in her fight for freedom. As the guards prepared to escort her back through the forest, Camilla took one last look at the farmland beyond the bridge. Somewhere out there was the life she dreamed of. A life where she could make her own choices, see her family again, and sleep without fear. She had failed to reach it today, but something told her that this encounter with Captain Harrison might have changed everything. The walk back to the palace was silent except for the sound of footsteps on the forest path. Camilla walked between Captain Harrison and Sergeant Blake, her bundle now carried by the captain himself. She noticed that he held it carefully, as if he understood how precious these simple items were to her. For the first time in 3 years, she felt like someone at the palace might actually be willing to listen to her side of the story. The return journey to Ravenscroft Palace felt completely different from Camilla's desperate flight through the same forest just hours earlier. Now, walking between the guards with her hands unbound, she found herself studying Captain Harrison's profile as he led their small group along the winding path. There was something in his weathered face that suggested years of difficult decisions and moral struggles. As they approached the palace walls, Camilla could see servants and other guards gathered in the courtyard, clearly having been informed about the morning's dramatic events. Their faces showed a mixture of curiosity and concern, and she noticed several of the kitchen staff whispering among themselves when they spotted her. Mrs. Henderson caught her eye and gave her a subtle nod of encouragement, which warmed Camilla's heart despite her uncertain situation. The Duke was waiting in the main hall, pacing back and forth in front of his ornate throne-like chair. His face was flushed with anger, and his elaborate clothing seemed even more ostentatious than usual against the backdrop of his rage. When he saw Camilla enter with the guards, his eyes immediately focused on the bundle that Captain Harrison carried. "Finally," the Duke exclaimed, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I trust you recovered all of my stolen property before this ungrateful girl could dispose of it." He strode forward with his hand extended, clearly expecting the captain to immediately hand over Camilla's belongings. Captain Harrison remained still, holding the bundle firmly in his arms. "Your Grace, I need to discuss the contents of this bundle with you privately before proceeding further. What I found doesn't match the description of stolen palace treasures that was provided to the guard unit." The Duke's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Captain Harrison, you forget yourself. I am the master of this palace, and I will examine those stolen goods immediately. Hand them over this instant. With respect, Your Grace, these appear to be personal belongings rather than palace property. I believe there may have been some misunderstanding about the nature of this young woman's possessions." Captain Harrison's voice remained steady and professional, but Camilla could see the tension in his shoulders as he stood his ground against his employer. The Duke's face grew even redder, and he took several steps closer to the captain. "Are you questioning my word, Harrison? Are you suggesting that I don't know my own property when I see it? That bundle contains valuable documents and jewelry that belong to this palace, stolen by an ungrateful servant who has abused my generosity for years." Camilla watched this exchange with growing amazement. No one had ever stood up to the Duke on her behalf before, and she could hardly believe that Captain Harrison was willing to risk his position to defend her. The other guards looked uncomfortable, clearly uncertain about whose authority they should follow in this unprecedented situation. "Your Grace," Captain Harrison said carefully, "perhaps we could examine the contents together, and you could point out which specific items belong to the palace. I want to ensure that justice is served properly, but I also want to make certain that no mistakes are made in either direction." The Duke's anger seemed to reach a boiling point. "How dare you lecture me about justice in my own palace?" "Guards, arrest Captain Harrison for insubordination and conspiracy to aid a criminal. Confiscate that bundle immediately and bring it to me." But the other guards hesitated, looking between their long-serving captain and their volatile employer. Sergeant Blake shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn between following the Duke's orders and respecting Harrison's authority within the guard hierarchy. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Your Grace," another voice interrupted from the back of the hall. Everyone turned to see Mrs. Henderson stepping forward, her usually cheerful face serious and determined. "If I may speak, I have some information that might be relevant to this situation." The Duke whirled around to face the head cook, his expression incredulous. "You? What could you possibly know about this matter that would be of any importance?" Mrs. Henderson straightened her shoulders and spoke clearly, so that everyone in the hall could hear her words. "I know that Miss Camilla has been saving bread from her own meals for weeks, Your Grace. I've watched her wrap small portions in cloth and put them aside, even when she was clearly still hungry. I also know that the coins she carries are the same copper pieces you give her as a weekly allowance, because I've seen her counting them carefully to make them last." The Duke's face showed a flicker of uncertainty before hardening again. "And what of the valuable jewelry and documents? I suppose you claim to know about those as well?" "I know about her mother's locket, yes," Mrs. Henderson replied firmly. "She's shown it to me several times when she was particularly sad about missing her family. It's a simple silver piece with her mother's portrait inside, not valuable to anyone except Miss Camilla herself." Captain Harrison nodded gratefully at Mrs. Henderson before addressing the Duke again. "Your Grace, with this additional testimony from a trusted member of your staff, I believe we need to reconsider the nature of these charges. I propose that we examine each item in the bundle publicly, so that everyone can see exactly what was in Miss Camilla's possession." The Duke looked around the hall, clearly realizing that he had an audience of servants and guards who were all watching this drama unfold. His position as the absolute authority in the palace was being challenged in front of everyone, and Camilla could see him calculating the political implications of his next move. "Fine," the Duke said through gritted teeth. "We'll examine the contents publicly. But when these stolen treasures are revealed, I expect appropriate consequences for everyone who has participated in this conspiracy." He gestured dramatically toward an ornate table near his chair. "Place the bundle there, Captain, and let's end this charade." Captain Harrison walked slowly to the table and carefully set down Camilla's bundle. With deliberate movements, he unwrapped the cloth and laid out each item separately where everyone could see them clearly. The pieces of bread and dried fruit looked modest and simple against the elaborate table. The few copper coins clinked softly as he placed them in a small pile. The letter to her family was folded neatly, its ordinary paper clearly visible to all observers. Finally, Captain Harrison lifted the silver locket and held it up to catch the light from the hall's windows. Even from a distance, everyone could see that it was old and well-worn, the kind of sentimental jewelry that families passed down through generations, rather than the ornate treasures that decorated the palace. The silence in the hall was deafening, as everyone stared at the humble collection of items. These were clearly the possessions of someone preparing for a difficult journey, not the valuables of a thief who had robbed her employer. Camilla felt tears welling up in her eyes as she saw her simple belongings displayed for all to judge. The Duke stared at the table for a long moment, his face cycling through various emotions as he realized that his accusations had been completely undermined in front of his entire household staff. The choice he made next would determine not only Camilla's fate, but his own credibility as the master of Ravenscroft Palace. The Duke stood frozen before the table, displaying Camilla's modest belongings, his face a mask of barely controlled fury and humiliation. The entire hall remained silent, with servants and guards alike holding their breath, as they waited to see how their master would respond to having his accusations so thoroughly disproven in public. Camilla watched the Duke's internal struggle with a mixture of hope and terror. She had seen his temper before, and she knew that being proven wrong in front of his staff would likely make him more dangerous than ever. Men like the Duke didn't accept humiliation gracefully, and she feared that his need to save face might lead to even worse consequences for everyone involved. Finally, the Duke cleared his throat and attempted to regain his composure. "Well," he said, his voice artificially calm, "it appears that my information about stolen valuable items was incorrect. However, that doesn't change the fact that this young woman attempted to leave my service without permission, breaking the terms of her employment agreement." Captain Harrison stepped forward respectfully. "Your Grace, if I may ask, what exactly are the terms of Miss Camilla's employment? It would help me understand the legal implications of today's events." The Duke's eyes flashed with irritation at this continued questioning, but he seemed to realize that backing down completely would damage his authority even further. "The terms are quite simple, Captain. Miss Camilla came to work here to pay off her family's substantial debts. She remains in my employment until those debts are fully satisfied, plus interest and the costs of her room and board during her time here." Camilla felt a surge of courage inspired by Captain Harrison's willingness to stand up for her. "Your Grace," she said, her voice stronger than she had expected, "when I arrived 3 years ago, my father's debt was £50. You said I could work it off in 6 months at most. But every time I ask about the balance, you tell me it has grown larger instead of smaller." Mrs. Henderson nodded from her position near the back of the hall. "If I may add, Your Grace, in 3 years of service, Miss Camilla has worked every day without complaint. She's tended your gardens, maintained your library, and helped in the kitchens whenever needed. Surely such dedicated service would have made a significant impact on any reasonable debt." The Duke's carefully maintained composure began to crack. "The costs of maintaining a servant are considerable. Food, shelter, clothing, protection. These things are not free, and the interest on the original debt continues to accumulate according to standard business practices." Captain Harrison frowned thoughtfully. "Your Grace, might I suggest that we review the actual employment contract and accounting records? If Miss Camilla's debt has indeed grown larger despite 3 years of labor, perhaps there's been some kind of clerical error that could be corrected." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone in the hall seemed to understand that the Duke's business practices were being called into question, and that any honest review of the records would likely reveal the truth about Camilla's situation. The Duke looked around at the faces watching him, calculating whether he could refuse such a reasonable request without appearing guilty of wrongdoing. "The records are private business matters," the Duke said finally, "not appropriate for public review. However, I am prepared to be generous in this situation." He paused dramatically, clearly trying to find a way to resolve the crisis while maintaining some dignity. Given Miss Camilla's years of service and her obvious distress about being separated from her family, I am willing to consider modifications to her employment terms. Camilla's heart leaped with hope, but she forced herself to remain cautious. The Duke's idea of generosity had proven unreliable in the past, and she suspected that any modifications he proposed would still heavily favor his own interests. Captain Harrison seemed to sense her skepticism. "What specific modifications did you have in mind, Your Grace? I think it would be beneficial for everyone if the terms were clearly stated and witnessed by the assembled staff." The Duke shot an angry look at the captain, clearly frustrated by his continued interference. "I was thinking that Miss Camilla could earn her freedom through additional service, perhaps another year or two of dedicated work, with the understanding that any future unruly behavior would result in serious consequences." The offer was so obviously unfair that several people in the hall exchanged shocked glances. Mrs. Henderson shook her head sadly, and even some of the guards looked uncomfortable with the Duke's proposal. Camilla felt her brief spark of hope crumble as she realized that the Duke had no intention of letting her go willingly. "Your Grace," Captain Harrison said carefully, "with respect, that doesn't address the fundamental question of whether Miss Camilla's debt has been fairly calculated. If she's already worked for 3 years and the debt has grown larger, another year or two of the same arrangement seems unlikely to resolve the situation." The Duke's temper finally exploded. "Enough. I am the master of this palace, and I will not have my business decisions questioned by servants and subordinates. Miss Camilla will return to her duties immediately, and anyone who continues to interfere with my authority will face immediate dismissal." But Captain Harrison stood his ground, his weathered face calm and determined. "Your Grace, I've served this palace faithfully for 20 years, and I've always tried to support your decisions. But I cannot in good conscience ignore what appears to be an unjust situation. If Miss Camilla's employment terms are truly fair and legal, surely you would have no objection to having them reviewed by an independent authority." The suggestion of involving outside authorities clearly alarmed the Duke. His business practices at the palace had always operated in a gray area of the law, relying on the isolation of his estate and the desperation of people like Camilla's family to avoid scrutiny. The thought of having his arrangements examined by legal experts or government officials was obviously his worst nightmare. "You forget yourself, Harrison," the Duke said in a dangerously quiet voice. "You are dismissed from my service immediately. Remove yourself from this palace before I have you arrested for insubordination and conspiracy." But Captain Harrison smiled sadly and reached into his jacket, pulling out an official-looking document. "Actually, Your Grace, I don't think that will be necessary. You see, I sent word to the regional magistrate yesterday about some concerns I had regarding employment practices at this estate. This morning's events have simply confirmed my suspicions." The Duke stared at the document in Harrison's hand with growing horror. "What is that? A warrant for investigation into allegations of unlawful detainment and exploitation of workers," Captain Harrison replied calmly. "The magistrate's representatives should be arriving within the hour to review your employment contracts and accounting records. I'm afraid that until their investigation is complete, Miss Camilla and any other affected workers are under the protection of the Crown." The hall erupted in whispers and gasps as the servants and guards processed this stunning development. Camilla felt her knees go weak with relief and disbelief. After 3 years of captivity, rescue had come from the most unexpected source. A palace guard who had risked everything to do what was right. The Duke's face had gone completely white, and for the first time since Camilla had known him, he appeared truly powerless. The carefully constructed world of control and intimidation that he had built around himself was crumbling, and everyone in the hall could see it happening. The next few hours passed like a whirlwind for Camilla. The magistrate's representatives arrived exactly as Captain Harrison had predicted, their official carriages rolling through the palace gates with an authority that made even the Duke step aside. They were led by a stern but fair-looking woman named Magistrate Wells, who immediately took charge of the situation with quiet efficiency. Camilla found herself sitting in the palace library, the same room where she had spent so many lonely hours reading about freedom and distant places. Now she was telling her story to Magistrate Wells and her clerk, who carefully recorded every detail of her 3 years at Ravenscroft Palace. For the first time since her arrival, someone in authority was actually listening to her side of the story. So you're telling me that your father's original debt was £50, and you were told it could be worked off in 6 months? Magistrate Wells asked, her pen poised over her notes. Yes, ma'am, Camilla replied, her voice growing stronger with each question. The Duke said it was a simple arrangement. I would work as a general servant, and my labor would pay down the debt until it was cleared. But every time I asked about the balance, he told me it had grown larger because of interest and living expenses. The magistrate frowned and made additional notes. And in 3 years you were never allowed to leave the palace grounds even for brief visits to see your family? Never, Camilla confirmed. The Duke said it was for my own protection, that the world outside was dangerous for a young woman alone. But the guards watched me constantly, and I knew that if I tried to leave, there would be serious consequences. Meanwhile, in the Duke's study, the investigation team was examining his employment records and financial documents. Captain Harrison had been right to be suspicious. The Duke's accounting practices were clearly designed to keep workers trapped indefinitely. Debts that should have been paid off in months were artificially inflated with excessive interest, rates and inflated charges for basic necessities. Mrs. Henderson and several other palace staff members were also interviewed, painting a picture of a household where the Duke's word was absolute law, and questioning his decisions led to swift punishment. The kitchen staff revealed that they had been forbidden from giving Camilla extra food, even when there was plenty to spare. The stable hands talked about how the Duke had specifically instructed them to report any attempts by servants to communicate with people outside the palace. As the investigation continued, more disturbing details emerged. Camilla learned that she wasn't the first young person to be trapped at the palace under similar circumstances. Over the years, the Duke had made employment arrangements with several desperate families, always with the promise that the debts could be quickly worked off. Some had eventually been released when their families managed to scrape together enough money to buy their freedom, but others had simply disappeared from the records with no explanation. Captain Harrison spent much of the afternoon helping the investigators understand the palace's security procedures and guard rotations. He admitted that he had been uncomfortable with some of the Duke's practices for years, but had convinced himself that it wasn't his place to interfere. The mornings chased through. The forest had finally forced him to confront the reality of what was happening under his watch. I kept telling myself that these people had entered into these arrangements voluntarily, he explained to Magistrate Wells. I figured that if they really wanted to leave, they would find a way. But seeing Miss Camilla this morning, so desperate for freedom that she was willing to risk everything for a chance to see her family again, I realized I had been making excuses for something I knew was wrong. As evening approached, Magistrate Wells called everyone together in the main hall for her preliminary findings. The Duke sat in his ornate chair, but all of his usual arrogance had been replaced by a pale, worried expression. The servants and guards gathered around, their faces showing a mixture of hope and anxiety about what the magistrate would announce. Based on my investigation today, Magistrate Wells began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall, I have found substantial evidence of unlawful employment practices at this estate. The employment contracts in question appear to be designed to trap workers indefinitely through excessive interest rates and inflated living expenses. She turned to look directly at the Duke. Your Grace, the arrangements you have made with Miss Camilla and several other workers appear to violate both regional employment laws and basic standards of human decency. Effective immediately, all such contracts are declared null and void. Camilla felt tears of relief streaming down her face as the magistrate's words sank in. After 3 years of captivity, she was finally, truly free. Around her, she could see similar expressions of joy and disbelief on the faces of other staff members who had been trapped in similar situations. Furthermore, Magistrate Wells continued, I am ordering that Miss Camilla and any other affected workers be provided with transportation to their home regions, along with compensation for their unlawful detainment. The exact amounts will be determined through further review of the palace's financial records. The Duke started to protest, but the magistrate silenced him with a sharp look. Your Grace, you should consider yourself fortunate that the affected parties are not pressing for criminal charges at this time. I suggest you use this opportunity to review all of your employment practices and ensure they comply with the law going forward. As the formal proceedings concluded, Camilla found herself surrounded by well-wishers from among the palace staff. Mrs. Henderson embraced her warmly, tears flowing freely down the older woman's cheeks. "I'm so happy for you, dear," she whispered. "I always hoped someone would help you get home to your family." Sarah, the young kitchen maid who had become something of a friend, pressed a small package of food into Camilla's hands. "For your journey home," she said shyly, "I saved some of the good bread and cheese for you." But the person Camilla most wanted to thank was Captain Harrison. She found him standing quietly near the windows, looking out at the forest where he had first decided to do the right thing instead of simply following orders. "Captain Harrison," she said softly, approaching him with her precious bundle of belongings clutched against her chest. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done. If you hadn't been willing to question the Duke's story, if you hadn't contacted the magistrate—" The captain turned to face her, and she could see the relief in his weathered features. "Miss Camilla, I should be thanking you. For 3 years I watched injustice happen in this palace and told myself it wasn't my responsibility to act. You reminded me that sometimes doing the right thing requires courage, even when it's difficult or dangerous." He paused and looked back toward the main hall where the Duke sat in defeated silence. "I've decided to resign from my position here. After 20 years of service, I think it's time for me to find employment somewhere that aligns better with my values." Camilla smiled through her tears. "Where will you go?" "I'm not sure yet," Captain Harrison admitted. "But I'm confident that a man who finally learns to stand up for what's right will find his place in the world. Just like you will, Miss Camilla. Just like you will." 2 weeks later, Camilla stood at the edge of the familiar village where she had grown up, her heart pounding with anticipation and nervousness. The magistrate's office had provided her with a horse and cart for the journey home, along with a substantial compensation payment that would help ensure her family's financial security for years to come. The ride had taken 3 days, giving her plenty of time to think about how much she had changed during her time away. The village looked smaller than she remembered, but wonderfully peaceful after the oppressive atmosphere of Ravenscroft Palace. Children played in the dusty streets, and she could hear the familiar sounds of daily life: chickens clucking, dogs barking, and the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer. Everything seemed exactly as she had left it, yet she knew that nothing would ever be quite the same. Camilla's hands trembled as she approached the small cottage where her family had lived when she left 3 years ago. The garden showed signs of careful tending, with vegetables and flowers growing in neat rows. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating that someone was home. She took a deep breath and knocked on the wooden door, her mother's silver locket hanging warm against her chest. The door opened to reveal a young woman with familiar brown hair and green eyes, though she was taller and more mature than Camilla remembered. For a moment, both sisters stared at each other in stunned silence, as if neither could quite believe what they were seeing. "Camilla?" Emma whispered, her voice filled with wonder and disbelief. "Is it really you?" "It's me, Emma," Camilla replied, tears already streaming down her face. "I'm finally home." The sisters fell into each other's arms, holding on tightly as if they were afraid that letting go might make this reunion disappear like a dream. Emma had grown into a beautiful young woman, but Camilla could still see traces of the 15-year-old girl she had left behind in her sister's face and mannerisms. "Camilla." "Emma, what's all the commotion?" Their mother's voice called from inside the cottage, and moments later she appeared in the doorway. Catherine Williams had aged in the 3 years since Camilla had seen her, with more gray in her hair and new lines around her eyes, but her face lit up with pure joy when she saw her older daughter. The family reunion that followed was everything Camilla had dreamed about during her darkest moments at the palace. Her father, Thomas, came running from the back garden where he had been working, his tools falling forgotten as he swept his daughter up in a bear hug that lifted her feet off the ground. For several minutes, the family simply held each other and cried, overwhelmed by the joy of being together again. "We never stopped hoping you would come home," her mother said through her tears. "Even when months passed without word, we knew in our hearts that you were still alive somewhere." "I wrote you a letter," Camilla said, pulling the carefully preserved paper from her bundle. "I carried it with me every day, hoping I would have a chance to send it or deliver it myself." Her father read the letter aloud to the family, his voice breaking several times as he learned about his daughter's experiences at Ravenscroft Palace. The shame and guilt he felt about the debt that had led to her captivity was clear on his face, but Camilla quickly reassured him that none of what happened had been his fault. You did what you had to do to survive, she told him firmly. The Duke took advantage of our desperation and trapped me with lies and false promises. But I'm free now, and I brought enough money to ensure that our family never has to worry about debt like that again. Over the following days, Camilla slowly readjusted to life in her childhood home. Emma had taken over many of the household responsibilities during her absence, and had even learned to read and write with help from the village priest. Their parents had aged but remained healthy, though Camilla could see the toll that worry and guilt had taken on them over the years. The village had changed somewhat during her absence as well. Several new families had moved in, and there was talk of building a proper school to serve the surrounding farms. Emma told her about the young man she had been courting, a kind farmer's son named James who had been asking permission to marry her. The wedding had been postponed indefinitely when Camilla disappeared, as Emma refused to celebrate such a joyous occasion while her sister was missing. "You don't have to wait for me anymore," Camilla assured her sister as they sat together in the garden one evening. "I want you to be happy, Emma. You've put your life on hold long enough." But Emma shook her head with a smile. "James has waited this long, he can wait a little longer. I want you to get to know him properly first, and I want you to be my maid of honor when we do get married. Besides, I think you might like him. He reminds me a little of that Captain Harrison you told us about." The comparison made Camilla curious, and when she met James the following week, she could indeed see similarities between him and the palace guard who had risked everything to help her. Both men had the same quiet strength and moral conviction that made them willing to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. As the weeks passed, Camilla began to think about what she wanted to do with her future. The compensation money from the magistrate meant that she didn't need to work immediately, but she felt a strong desire to use her experiences to help others who might be in similar situations. She had learned to read and write quite well during her time at the palace, and she thought perhaps she could become a teacher or work with local officials to help identify and prevent exploitation of vulnerable families. One day, a letter arrived that surprised the entire family. It was from Captain Harrison, who had tracked down their address through the magistrate's office. He wrote that he had indeed resigned from his position at Ravenscroft Palace and was now working with regional authorities to investigate similar situations at other estates. He asked if Camilla would be willing to testify in cases involving other trapped workers, as her experience and articulate testimony could help free people who were still suffering under arrangements, like the one she had escaped. The request gave Camilla a sense of purpose that she hadn't felt since returning home. She realized that her ordeal at the palace, terrible as it had been, had given her unique knowledge and credibility that could be used to help others. She wrote back to Captain Harrison immediately, agreeing to assist with the investigations and thanking him once again for the courage he had shown in standing up for justice. As she sealed the letter and prepared to send it, Camilla reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few short months. She had gone from being a trapped and hopeless prisoner to a free woman with the power to help others gain their freedom as well. The silver locket around her neck caught the afternoon sunlight, reminding her of the dreams and determination that had sustained her through the darkest times. Looking out at the peaceful village street where children played and neighbors greeted each other with warm smiles, Camilla felt a deep sense of gratitude for the simple freedoms that she had once taken for granted. She was home, she was free, and she was surrounded by people who loved her. After 3 years of captivity, she had finally reclaimed not just her liberty, but her sense of purpose and hope for the future. The story that had begun with a desperate escape attempt through a dark forest had ended with a young woman finding her way back to the light. And though the scars of her experience would always remain, Camilla knew that she was stronger for having survived them, and that her strength could now be used to help others find their own path to freedom.